or you want to share it with a friend at some point, you can do that. So my question for you is, have you ever been in a situation where somebody's telling you something, they're telling you a story or they're explaining something, and there's this dissonance, like their face doesn't match it or their gestures don't match it, their posture's off somehow, like they're telling you a really happy story and they're all slumped over, or the sound of their voice isn't quite right. And just, put a few words in the chat if you have experienced that. Like, I'd love to hear somebody who's had an experience about that. Tell me what it was like for you. Maybe someone would like to unmute and just tell me, what was it like for you when you were on the other side of that story? And the gestures and the expression of the body didn't match the story you were being told. What did you feel when that happened? Somebody want to just tell me? For some reason, my chat is
sort of gaslighted.
Sort of gaslighted. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah, like something was going on and you didn't have all the pieces. Yeah, most of us find it really kind of uncomfortable. And oftentimes we're not necessarily aware of where the dissonance we're experiencing is coming from. So I'm curious if anyone really found yourself uncomfortable. Like, put a hand up if you found yourself uncomfortable, right? Even though maybe the person telling the story was also uncomfortable. Yeah,
Oh,
so
yeah.
lots of us have had that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was complaining about what his wife reacted to his tone of voice, and he was doing that tone of voice
To you.
to me. And I was able to show, he was talking from his upper nasal area
Hmm.
and not breathing low. And it was really interesting.
I bet it sounded kind of angry.
Yeah, very defensive
Right.
and guarded, and trying to say how much personal work he had done and how
Right.
this wasn't him.
Right. Trying to convince you. Right. Well, the voice is
Yeah.
saying something else. Yeah.
And he was asking for feedback.
Well,
And
that's
so,
good. That's rare.
yeah, and finally I realized, oh, you're talking from your head, you're up in your upper
Nose, the
forehead,
middle passes.
upper nasal, and you're not breathing.
Yeah. That'll make somebody sound angry usually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the story, Carol. That's a really good illustration. Yeah. So it often happens sometimes that there's either a gesture that really pulls you in. Like sometimes people will tell you a story and they'll have their, heart-rending story and their hands are on their heart. And you feel that. And sometimes the stories don't match. We don't quite understand, why is this person telling me that they've done all their work and they're still angry? They're still defensive and angry, right? So this what I'm pointing to here is, the question is like, what are somatic stories? Like, what do I mean by somatic stories? Stories that the body is telling. Well, our minds are always searching for meaning and predictability. So our mind is going to make up a story that helps us make sense of things, right? But our bodies are going to be telling us a different kind of story. The body understands, it knows, it learns through experience and feelings. So we can have two different stories going on. For example, in the story that you just told, Carol, this person mentally had a story about, I've been doing my work, I'm good. But his body was still telling a story of, I'm not comfortable, I can't breathe. And the sound that I'm making is sounding angry, right? Maybe I am angry,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
like two stories that were being told at the same time. So these can be very different stories. They can be stories that reinforce each other, but they can also be really different stories. And most of the time, we are conditioned, we are trained not to respond to the body story. So that your friend there was asking for feedback is very rare. Most of the time, people are trying to suppress or deny or ignore the other story that's being told, the story that the body is telling, concurrent with the verbal story. So these stories come at us at the same time. The body will always be telling a story. We're always talking. So our bodies are always telling some kind of story. The physical state of your conditioning, all of that is present in your presentation, in the way that you present yourself, and the sound of your voice, your breathing, everything. So both of these stories are happening at the same time. And it's curious that we don't pick up the body stories very much. And we've kind of been trained socially not to do that. So if you've ever worked in a big office and you, your colleague might be having a bad day or whatever, you don't really want to talk about that. So we just kind of ignore all these stories and signals that our bodies are sending. Because for us to be in, with some people that we don't know well, people we may not feel safe with, a professional setting, even if extended family setting, we don't know people well. Or a friend that we want to protect their ego, we don't want to hurt their feelings. So we're kind of trained not to respond to, and sometimes not even to notice, the somatic stories that we're being told, the other story. And bodies are really honest, it turns out. Bodies will tell you pretty much the truth. And there's people that have made a profession, these professional, lie detectors for like the CIA and FBI. There's no code there, but there's certainly things you can learn to spot when the stories don't add up. The verbal story and the body story don't add up. So this turns out to be really useful for us when we're working with people, especially if we need to help them with places that are kind of deep and personal. We need to have a way to get to the real stories, the lived stories, the felt stories, the experienced stories. So it turns out if you learn to see, and sometimes we have to kind of decondition ourselves because we've been so conditioned not to respond. And if your coworker comes in with a sad face, you don't necessarily ask about it. You might ask about the annual report or whatever you're working on, but you won't ask about the sadness in their eyes. So we've been deconditioned or we've been conditioned not to see and not to respond. And yet it's probably the most direct way to get to what's really bothering someone, to get to what's really underneath someone's story, the verbal story, the meaning making and sense making they've made, and to get to the lived experience that they're having. When we can do this, we create a sense of resonance when we actually acknowledge in a kind way the stories the person's body is telling. They're going to feel, if they feel safe with us, they will feel seen and they will feel felt by us, like we're really attending to the whole of their story and the whole of their being. And it also will give us fairly quickly access to the deeper lived experience, the deeper meanings, the deeper understandings, the lived felt experience that the person is often stuck in, versus the mind's interpretation, which is often partially true, but not complete, right? So if we can imagine in the story that you told so nicely, Carol, that your friend may have been feeling defensive, and obviously he might have been asked to do personal work, right? So there might be some part of him that's feeling hurt, like I'm not okay. And that might be underneath what seems like anger. So when we go for these somatic stories, the stories that the body is telling, we often get the real lived experience, the deeper experience that someone is having. And because we're going deep and we're going deep quickly with people, we need to do that with their permission, and we need to do that with respect. For example, if you had just given that person, hey, you sound angry, right? They might not have been so receptive to your feedback, right? So we have to really create a connection with people. They have to feel safe with us. They have to feel like we're going to respect them. And then we can actually get access to these really deep stories. And this makes your work, if you're working with people in a therapeutic context or even a coaching context, this makes your work more effective. So have you ever had the experience where somebody reflected you in such a complete way that you felt totally seen and held? And how much of what they reflected was your affect, your feelings? instead of just the story, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to reflect the whole experience that someone's having, not just the story. Most of the time we get stuck in our stories because they don't contain all the pieces we need to find resolution. So we need to have a way to kind of step around the story and get to the real heart of the issue, the real feelings, the real experience that's there. And sometimes these can be traumatic experiences for people, so we really do need to be careful. This is actually very powerful. It seems very simple, but it's very powerful work. So let's explore how people tell these stories. Let's go a little bit into like, what are those stories and what do they look like? So here's my lovely little storyteller. My favorite little, so I just got a dragon helping her in the corner there. But she's telling this little group of children a story. And she's not just standing there talking. She's living the story for them. She's being the dragon. She's being the whoever the dragon is facing, right? She's embodying the story. And when somebody embodies a story, we understand it on a body basis ourselves. So when she does this, we do this too, and we feel that story with her. We accompany her in that story. If she was just standing saying words, we wouldn't be going along for the ride like that. But we're that dragon right now with her. And that's the magic of the body stories, is they're real, they're lived, they're felt. And those are the stories we are wanting to find here. It turns out that words are not enough. And as you can tell, this guy's caught a fish and it was this big, right? It wasn't this big, it wasn't that big, it was this big, right? So often we find ourselves at a limit with words, and the depth of what we experience in our lived experience as human bodies definitely transcends words. So we are forced to go to other means to try to communicate, right? I don't know if the fish was really that big, but you can see it felt that way to this little fisherman here. It felt that way. It felt like it was a big fish. So when we get information like that, when we see the hands and we see the face and we see how excited this person is, we're sharing in the experience this guy had catching that fish, right? It's taking us there. Whereas if he just said, I caught a really big fish, yeah, nice, right? But you wouldn't go along for the ride. So there's different ways that people can signal something besides just the words. That's our face, that's gestures like big fish, that's posture, movement, that's our timing, when we do things, when we don't. Our breath is key. You can tell a lot about a person's physical state just from the way they're breathing. The breath supports the voice, the prosody, the melody of the voice. So that's also carrying information for us. Now, most of the time, even though we're not consciously responding to these signals, we are being influenced by them. We feel them. Like, have you ever walked into a room and you know something happened there? Like maybe you walked into some people that were having a fight and they get quiet when you walk in, but you can feel the vibe, right? There's stuff being communicated there in the tension in their bodies, in the way they're breathing, in the where they're placing their eyes. Like you're going to pick all that stuff up and it's going to affect you and you're going to feel it. So part of the art of working with somatic signals is beginning to see them, beginning to recognize what's over there belongs to the person, what's your own responses, what's your own feelings, what's your own history, what's their history, right? We have to separate a lot of things out to be able to be kind of clean in terms of our observations. So there are, things that can kind of help us with this. This is from Paul Ekman's work, and there's some controversy about this, but I found it to be helpful just to have a starting place, to look at, what's the difference? What do people do differently with their faces when they're angry, right? You can see the brow furrowed here, and you can see the lips are pulled tight, and the upper lid has come up in the eye there, which is very different from fear. where the lips are again pulled back, but the mouth is open, the eyebrows are up, and you can imagine this guy's head is pulled back like it's something scary. He's going to move his head back. So I found these to be a useful starting place for questions, for inquiry, right? And it helped me start to look at the face in terms of like, what is being used? What muscles are being used, right? What is being communicated? And how does that fit with the story I'm being told? So this is actually these are all quite deep rabbit holes. You can go quite a long ways down any one of these studies. But there's a lot of information on faces, and we're pretty cued to them. On the other hand, we have more control over our face because it is such a strong part of our signaling. We have more ways to, kind of control our facial expression, which is sometimes when somebody is like trying to tell you a sad story and trying not to cry, right? You feel uncomfortable because you can feel the control they're putting on their face muscularly to not show a genuine expression. So faces have a lot of information, and they're also a place where we have a lot of control. So we're always looking at if it's not just the face, but what else is going on with the person to kind of help me understand the whole story. So that's one of the places we want to start to look. And it's amazing how little we actually see about faces when I send my students to different quizzes, right? It's like how little we actually read the face. Because again, we've taught ourselves not to see. Because when we see, we also feel. So one story I like to tell is I was teaching in Shanghai at one point, and I had to walk from my hotel about 10 minutes to my venue. And there was a subway station right by the place that I was walking. And like 300 people would come streaming out of that subway station while I was walking by. And can you imagine what would happen if I saw each of those people? I really let myself see them because I'd feel them. And my poor little nervous circuits would be blown by all of that, right? So it's a little bit protective. We only kind of let in what we can handle in certain ways. But there's a lot of information that we let go by. And so part of the art is actually managing ourselves so that we can hold what we see and feel from another person. It turns out that people have done for the body posture what was done for the face in terms of identifying somebody who's angry, fists are up in this one here, somebody who's maybe scared or at least pushing something away, right? Compared to this person, when we're happy, we often open up the front of our body, right? We're pretty predictable about that. And when we're sad or burdened, we will slump, right? So we do have kind of a sense when we look at somebody what they're feeling. So there's a lot of information here. The problem is not that there's too little information. The problem is that there's too much. And we have to learn when we start to see how to use that information. The other thing is, some of you may know the blob opera, courtesy of Google. I invite you to Google it if you want to. But the point here is that the voice also has melody. And the voice rides on the breath. And the breath is connected to our heart, connected to the pulmonary system. So the quality of our voice is telling you, if you're listening, a lot about that person's state, right? Like the story that you told, Carol, so beautifully was, this person's breathing high. They're not completely comfortable. Their breath isn't dropped down into the lower parts of the lungs. Something's wrong, right? We only breathe high when we're under stress. So we can hear that in the voice. This is why people can do great work on the phone, because they can hear the quality of the breathing and therefore the quality of the body in the sound of the voice. So all of these things are our tools, if you will, in learning to work with somatic signals. The other is gesture. And there's lots of different kinds of gestures. There's people that do this professionally, that study gesture, right? But the gestures that we're interested in are the ones that are kind of metaphors. So these are the gestures that tell us something about a person's deeper truth. And I'll give you a couple stories here. So I was this is an organizational story. I was working with a man who had a small company, And his employees kept complaining that he wasn't leading. He was too weak. They called him too weak. And he was starting to feel pretty bad. So his assistant, the person he wanted to represent him for his assistant, was this huge guy. So people were turning to his assistant instead of turning to him. And I noticed the way he stood. He stood with his shoulders hunched. He stood like there was something at his back that wasn't very friendly. And so I just put my hand back there with his permission and said, what would it feel like if you really felt safe and had backing? And his posture changed immediately. He stood up, his chin came up, he opened the front of his body, and he said, I think I could do my job. And I said, well, let's imagine what you need back here so that you can be in that position. You can leave from that place. So that's one story. I just did a piece of work recently with a woman who had to really challenge her family about something that had happened to one of her children that was not a good thing. And the family was very religious, very, very strict, very religious. And she wanted to assert her feminine energy, her power as a woman. And she did that. She managed to separate her kid and take care of things. But then she had a sore throat. Her throat wouldn't let her speak, right? So she kept struggling with this sore throat. She'd challenge her family and then she'd have a sore throat. She'd challenge her family. So we finally realized that the sore throat was actually saying, and yet I love my family. I'm part of them. It's hard and scary to push them back like this. So there were two parts of her. One was like, I'm a good mother. I'm going to do the right thing. This religion is not good. The other was like, but they're my family and I love them. Right? So we needed to give space for both of those voices in order for her to be able to be well and do what she wanted to do. The last story I'll tell is I was working with a woman. Again, this is a business constellation she came for, but she had her hands over her belly. She kept putting her hands over her belly. And I noticed it, and I was just curious. And the problem was she had 4 shops, and her shops were doing really well. And her employees were like, open another shop, open another shop. And she was frozen. She couldn't do it. And so I asked her a little bit about the hands on the belly, and she'd had 4 abortions. And she was afraid if she opened another shop, she'd have another abortion because the shops were selling clothing and tools to mothers and babies. So she was afraid, since she had these shops that were taking care of, it's like there was a shop for each abortion, right, that she'd built and they'd done really well. And she was afraid if she had another shop, she'd end up having another abortion, and she couldn't face that. She loved kids. So there was a whole story in the way she was just holding onto her belly, right? And just by gently asking and inquiring about these, I'm able to actually find the deeper story, the story underneath the story. And this is important for our clients if we're going to get to the root cause of the issues that they're bringing us. Now, there is a little bit of a warning here. There's no dictionary. There's no place you can go and say, this gesture means that, right? I wish. I really wish. But it's not like that. You have to kind of be a field anthropologist and you kind of have to do your own inquiry with each person that shows up for you. There are common patterns, but everybody is unique and their story is unique and the story their bodies are holding is unique. So we have to figure out which signals matter, which means we kind of have to know what is this person's kind of baseline and what's something that I should pay attention to. What's a hot spot, right? What's something that's like, doesn't really make sense, or it's kind of too big or too small. Like, for example, this woman, who's a very capable businesswoman, is sitting here with her hands clutching her belly. And like, that doesn't quite go with everything else I'm seeing, right? There's something else being told here. So I'm going to be both feeling with her. This is what I call we're social anthropologists, right? We're out here watching people in a different way. I'm going to be observing her, but I'm also going to be having some feeling for her so that she's not alone with whatever we're dealing with. And we have to kind of manage both of these ways of being when we're doing this work. We have to be observant enough to see the signal, right? To know, like, here's this very capable businesswoman, right? Very successful, with her hands on her belly, like she's holding on to something. And she was quite comfortable with me. I tested, right? No, I had checked that out and it was like, nope, there's something else. So we have to be able to have compassion and feel with our clients at the same time we're observing, we're watching, and we're noticing the things that they do. And that's a little bit of a stretch. Most of us are either like we're all into feeling or we actually go all the way out and observe. And we kind of need to be able to hold both forms of attention. We kind of need to know what's the baseline for my client, what's their kind of normal behavior, what fits, what doesn't, and what am I seeing that might be a bit different than that? And how do I pick that up? And so the other thing we have to do, the other thing is these signals can happen really fast. Like I had a woman who put her hands up on her heart very briefly, telling me a story about how difficult it was for her to connect with people. And I paused her as soon as I saw this hand go by her heart. I said, pause right there. Just hold on a moment. And I put my hand back, I mirrored her gesture so she could see what she was doing. It's really important. And then I said, tell me what that feels like. Tell me what that means when you put your heart there and your hand there. And it turns out that the story was that her parents had divorced and she had ended up spending, as a very young child, quite a lot of time alone in the house with a distraught parent when the parents had split. And she was afraid. She was afraid to get close. She didn't want to go through that again, seeing people she loved hurt each other like that. So there was this place where she was actually both feeling the pain of the parent and her own pain and protecting herself. That gesture was telling me that whole story. So signals happen fast. They go by fast. We have to be alert. We have to be able to stop the signal, right? Like you were able, Carol, when you said like, hey, let's reflect on how you're making that sound. Then we have to be able to help them understand what they're doing so they do it again. Because it's in the posture, it's in the act of doing the thing that the story in the body lives. So we want to be able to make them aware of that. And then we can just ask with their permission and with respect, tell me more. What is that about? So for example, Carol, with the story that you told, if you'd said like, well, what is it that makes you breathe high when you say this? What is it that makes this stressful? Right? You're going to get a lot more information and you're going to get a different quality and kind of information than you would if you had not included the body signal. So this little webinar is kind of like a teaser, right? First of all, to get you curious, right? I want you to be curious about all the information that people are giving you and to start to watch, to start to see, and to realize those are important stories, right? And they're deep stories. Like we take people to very personal and private places. I've gone over the edge. I've gone too fast, too quick with people and gone into things where they weren't ready to face that thing themselves. So we have to be careful with it. We have to be kind and be able to do this with permission and with care. So at this point, I just want to get my little workshop pitch in, and then I'd love to have some space for questions. I've done this now for over 20 years. I got started about 2001 watching bodies. And so I do have a master class. It's live in person. It's better in person. There's so much I can teach you in person coming up in September. And then in conjunction with that, we have a workshop with my colleague, Mary Seamster, who does pre and perinatal trauma work. So we'll be looking at how really early traumas, birth traumas, early childhood traumas imprint in the body and the stories that are being told there. So that is the workshop and the masterclass. And I'd love to see someone there if you want to come. enjoy this. I'm sorry, I can't. I've done this online. It's not as satisfying for me to teach this online. I much prefer to have bodies there. So that's an offering, and I would love to take questions at this point. Questions or comments? Yeah, just go ahead and unmute yourself.
I have a comment about the breathing that was just, I thought of you because I went to the Carole King beautiful performance,
Yeah.
and during the first half, I noticed that I wasn't breathing. A whole lot of the time I wasn't breathing. And then I realized it was when, not when one person was singing, but when a whole bunch of people were singing. And then I looked closer and I went, they're not singing, they're lip syncing. And I thought, this is really weird. So at the intermission, I actually Googled, about lip syncing in musicals, and it's a thing. I had no idea, but it impacted me so hard.
Yeah,
When it was the one person who was playing Carole King was singing, it didn't happen that way.
right, because
But
they were
when the
really
whole
singing,
thing, yeah, it was so
right?
uncomfortable.
That's an example of resonance, right? And one of the ways you can pick up somatic signals is you will mirror the thing that they're doing. Like this happens to most of us all the time. We stop breathing
Yeah,
because our client isn't breathing, right?
yeah, without even knowing it.
Without even
I
knowing
mean,
it. So your own body is an instrument as well, right? If you suddenly feel yourself tense or your throat is tight and you're like, I'm fine, what's going on? Take a look
well,
because you,
what's cool was years like pay attention to breathing. Like, how do I? There's too many things to pay attention to, and then it was like I don't have to pay attention
no,
because
your body will do it for
it's
you.
like it happens if you just pay attention to yourself.
Yeah, true. Thanks. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Monica?
Well, I'm curious about doing this with a group when, let's say, like this sort of a format where you're kind of like facilitating, holding space, and there is a group
Mhm.
of, and just like the amount of information that you have to process and take in. And
Mhm.
that's like a big question, but
Well, no, groups are fascinating, and actually, breathing is really something you can learn to see and track in a group. Because I've shocked groups. I've had a whole group go to high breathing, and so all kinds of things are possible, right? And groups will. So if you're leading a group, you want to form the group. You want to get them to be unconsciously aware of each other because it's less work for you. Because people will naturally entrain in a group if they feel safe enough. And then then it's you and the group, or maybe subgroups. Sometimes you have subgroups, and not you and all these individuals. So people are unconsciously aware of each other and they will start to kind of sync up in ways. And if you can learn to see that and feel it yourself and work with it, it makes it a lot easier to work with groups because you kind of know where the group is, like even like physiologically where they are, or when they're getting irritated or when they're getting restless. And you can start to kind of work with them as a group. And you'll also see where there's outliers in a group. So groups will unconsciously form little waves. Like one person will scratch their nose and the next will move their elbow and the next one will shift their legs. And you'll see this little energy ripple go around a group, right? And the more formed the group is, the more they do that unconsciously. And if you kind of go to open focus, you can kind of see these ripples and waves in groups. I had one workshop, I was doing a fairly big workshop, and I had one woman sitting directly opposite me. And her body was very tense. She was very tense. Nice person, just the way she carried her body. And the wave would go boom, boom, right? She just simply couldn't move with the group. She was, I think she's a little bit on the spectrum and just couldn't pick up that thing. So there's a lot of somatic information. And if you start to look at how is the group, what are they doing as a group, right? How are they interacting with each other? You can make it easier on yourself, I'll say easier, than if you're trying to track all these individuals because your circuits would blow if you were doing that. Yeah. So there's a lot that we can kind of actually take into understanding groups. I mean, it's a group of bodies in a circle, right? They're humans. They're going to be doing those human things. In a group, you can hear the quality of laughter, the sound. Groups have timing. A formed group will not let itself get too loud. They'll reach a certain ceiling and then they'll come back down. An unformed group, you're going, should people be quiet, you know? So there's all kinds of things that you can pick up in groups with this stuff too. So it's, but you have to start observing.
Yeah.
You have to start to listen and look. And that's what we usually don't do. So, yeah. So I hope I've made you curious. So email me, I can send you some resources. Okay. Other questions before we close? Yes, Pragna?
Hey, so good to see you again,
Yes,
Jane.
lovely. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah, so I'm just curious about, let's take the example of when you were interacting with somebody and they kept their hand on their heart. In my one-on-one interaction or coaching practice, I've seen people do that. Some people are really aware what's going on, and some is like, I just do it. It just makes me comfortable.
Uh-huh.
How can we one help the individual be curious about what happens,
Right.
or help them deepen their own understanding? Because when I'm sure, as you would have seen, there are so many people who are just not even aware what's going on.
Right.
It's just something that I always do.
Right.
So
Yeah. So
any tips on that?
yeah. So that, I mean, most of the time when we're doing these signaling, we're not aware. Well, most of us are not aware that we're doing this. Because these are deep body patterns, these are unconscious. So I would first check it out. Is this something this person often does? Really? Right? Is it? And then the other thing that matters, and remember, these are two stories that are weaving together. So what are the words that happen when this gesture happens? Right? Because that matters, right? If I'm telling a story, but I'm not able to tell the whole story with words, my body will try to tell it. And so if it isn't just a routine baseline gesture, if it isn't just part of their baseline, and it's coming up in a particular spot, then I usually say, well, just hold it right there. You're telling me this story about that. I'm curious, and I usually mirror for them and say, what is that? What is, this might be the thalamus, I don't know. What does your heart say about that? Or what is your feeling about that? Or how does that make you feel when you tell me this story? So I'm just going to use it as a doorway. And I have to have permission. I have to have the body's permission, not just the mind. Now, in a coaching context, people will say, sure, I'll tell you anything, but not really. Their body is still saying, nope, I'm breathing high, I'm under stress, I'm unguarded, right? So I don't have permission. There's no point in going there. I'm not going to get in, right? I have to have the rapport, the permission before I'm going to get into that place with them. And that's respect. That's just like, you have the right to hold yourself. You have the right to hold whatever you're going to hold, right? You're sovereign. You have that right. So it's just this idea of like, I really respect your boundaries. I'm not going to go in if you don't want me in. And if I get a no, I get a no and I go. Right? Okay, fine. We'll stay on the surface. You're paying me. All right, fine. Right? It's your money. Right? And it takes people time to, because this is really deep. This is where we live. Right? When we address these body signals, this is where people live. This is the real stuff. So people tend to be protective here. And like I say, I have gone over the edge with people. I was demonstrating something and I thought people understood that I could like get in there. And I had one fellow who was actually a judge. He was a really dignified person. And we were just exploring some things. And I said, your eyes look so sad. Here you are, this very accomplished person, but your eyes just look so sad to me. And his face changed immediately. He got very sad. And he said, when I was 5 years old, my mother committed suicide. And he had a lot of shame about that. And so I had to do a lot of repair and work around the shame that came with that. It turns out my dad is committed suicide, took his own life. So I had a platform from which I could reach him. But I had inadvertently taken him to a place that was quite tender. So we have to be careful, right? And this was actually in front of a training group. So I was like, oh, we have to be quite careful with this. At the same time, if we have a trusting relationship with someone, people feel so seen. They feel so heard that we're attending to their whole message, right? So this idea of permission is really critical. I can teach a whole course on permission because it's so critical, right? Come to the masterclass. We will address that. Yeah. Maybe one more question before we part. Anyone else? One more question?
Is the September 16th, that's a Monday, and what times?
I will have to look, but I think it's 10 to 4 or something like that. That's a good question. It should be on if you follow the link, it should have that information on it. So thanks for that. Yeah. Any other questions before we part?
Just wanted to say thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Is there a question here I can't hear? Hold on a sec. Let me see here. Did somebody just ask a question I didn't see or hear? Okay.
I wanted to ask when your sabbatical is over.
September 18th.
I was a little
September 18th. Yes, I'm on a short
18th.
sabbatical right now, theoretically. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Right.
Sabbatical.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope I've really piqued your curiosity. I hope you're going to start looking with fresh eyes and really being interested in the stories that people's bodies are telling, because there's just so much richness there. And it's precious when somebody really can hold our whole story. So you'll get a link for the recording if you want to go back and look at anything. And it's been a pleasure to spend this short time with you. So please check in again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.